The second major portion of the Bible is the New Testament. It is comprised of 27 books. First are the four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These books relate to us the traditions of the life and ministry of Jesus. Following the Gospels is the Acts of the Apostles. This book is held by most scholars to have been written by the same author as the Gospel of Luke. The Acts of the Apostles is the second part of Luke's Gospel. In it, Luke takes us from the story of Jesus and continues to go on to tell the story of the church and the spread of the gospel message. Following the book of Acts are the epistles. 21 of the 27 books of the New Testament are letters, most of which were written by Paul. We also have the letters of James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Jude. Lastly is the book of Revelation. In Raymond Brown's introduction to the New Testament, he writes that Revelation is widely popular for the wrong reasons. Many people assume that Revelation contains some guide as to how the world is going to end. Revelation is the genre of apocalyptic literature. In biblical apocalyptic literature, a vision is given to a human being, generally by an angel. The human is brought to a certain vantage point, usually the heavens, where the angel can explain the vision. What is revealed is the transformation that will take place on earth. This view of the world, or of the future, is to help interpret events that are happening on earth. As Brown points out, the persecution of God's people by the world empires brings into question God's control over what is going on. Apocalyptic literature provides a visionary disclosure or view from the heavens, which reassures that God is in control and that good will be victorious. In the case of the book of Revelation, this vision was sent to reassure and strengthen the Christians who were facing Roman persecution. Jesus' story was first relayed by his followers as they went out to proclaim the good news. They believed that they were living in the end of times and that a new time was breaking in, a time which would be fully broken in at the second coming of Christ. Their expectation was that this would happen within their own lifetime. The earliest writings were in the forms of letters, which were addressed to specific communities and written in response to specific questions or concerns. It was not until the generation of Jesus' followers who knew him directly were dying or being killed off that the need arose to write down the story of Jesus. By the time the first gospel is said to have been written, 30 years had passed. While the gospel writers may have had some written sources available, they relied heavily on oral tradition. Richard Bauckham is a biblical scholar and theologian who has explored the question of how oral tradition would have been passed on. His book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, was awarded the Michael Ramsey Prize in 2009. This is a biennial award which seeks to acknowledge the most promising contemporary theological writing and to identify it for a wider Christian readership. Bauckham adopts the position that the transmission of the Jesus traditions took place as formal controlled tradition, in which the eyewitnesses played an important part. Bauckham's contention is that the disciples did not set the tradition in motion and then step back, but rather that they remained actively preaching throughout their entire lives. He maintains that the oral tradition has not been lost in the anonymity of collective transmission. To emphasize the importance of eyewitnesses to oral tradition, Bauckham quotes a fragment written by Papias, who was describing a time when he himself was collecting the oral traditions regarding Jesus. The fragment is preserved in the writings of Eusebius. And he writes, "I shall not hesitate also to put into properly ordered form for you everything I learned carefully in the past from the elders and noted down well for the truth of which I vouch. For unlike most people, I did not enjoy those who have a great deal to say, but those who teach the truth. Nor did I enjoy those who recall someone else's commandments, but those who remember the commandments given by the Lord to the faith and proceeding from the truth itself. And if by chance anyone who had been in attendance on the elders should come my way, I inquired about the words of the elders, that is, what according to the elders Andrew or Peter said, or Philip, or Thomas, or James, or John, or Matthew, or any other of the Lord's disciples were saying. For I did not think that information from books would profit me as much as information from a living and surviving voice. Here he is suggesting that Papias expected that the living voice was not the voice of the collective group or community, but rather that of individuals. According to Bachman, the 12 apostles formulated traditions into some type of official form, which were then passed down formally to others who then went out and preached. By formal controlled tradition is formal in the sense that there is a clearly defined teacher, a clearly identified student, and a clearly identified body of material which is passed on. It is controlled in that the material is being memorized and preserved intact. Bachman further develops his theory of the transmission of tradition by noting that oral traditions were oral performances. Following the studies of other scholars on oral tradition, he holds that there exists a certain acceptance of variations in the retelling of a tradition based on the type of tradition being transmitted. For example, in the case of proverbs and poems, a verbatim reproduction of the material was mandatory. A mistake of even a single word by the person reciting would be corrected by the listeners in general, and if the reciter hesitates, he would be assisted by the group, drawing on their collective memory. Some flexibility is allowed in the case of material such as parables and historical accounts of people and events. This means that the basic features of a story are fixed. The control is absent when the material is not considered to be relevant to the identity of the community. The question of which books were held to be canonical and which were not is long and complex. Ultimately, the decision to include or exclude a book was based on two criteria. First, that it was written by an apostle, either directly or by a disciple who had expanded the apostle's thought. Second was the conformity to a rule of faith. For example, the Gospel of Peter was ultimately rejected because it led some people to believe that Jesus did not suffer on the cross and therefore was not human. The Gnostic Gospels were rejected because of their claim to possess secret knowledge. From written accounts of the early church fathers, such as Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Irenaeus, and St. Justin, by about 200 CE, most church writers seem to have accepted the four Gospels, the letters of Paul, the Acts of the Apostles, 1 Peter and 1 John as being canonical. The remaining 7 came to be accepted by the 4th century, as we have in a letter in 367, which names all 27 books. The official statement of the canonical list was not made until the Council of Trent in 1546, but by that time the council was merely rubber stamping what had been accepted for hundreds of years. Irenaeus, in his work Against Heresies, argues that there can be no more nor no less than 4 Gospels. What was his rationale for only 4? Was it because there were the 4 zones of the earth? Because of the 4 horsemen in the apocalypse? Or because he just liked the number 4? If you guessed A, you were correct. Because there were the 4 zones of the earth, and because there were the 4 winds, Irenaeus felt there could be no more than 4 Gospels. The Gospels Matthew, Mark, and Luke are together referred to as the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic comes from the Greek word synoptikos, meaning seeing the whole together. The literary relationship of these Gospels shows that they share a great deal of their material. 80% of the material that is in Mark is found in Matthew, and 65% of Mark is found in Luke. This has led scholars to the conclusion that these 3 shared some common sources. The question of who copied who is referred to as the synoptic problem. The standard view in New Testament scholarship is that Mark, using oral and potentially some written sources, wrote his gospel first in about 70 CE. Additional analysis yields that there is material which is found in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. Biblical scholars have proposed that an additional source, which is referred to as Q, was an additional source that both Matthew and Luke shared. This proposed solution is known as the two-source hypothesis. Material which is unique to each gospel, such as the stories of the birth of Jesus in Matthew, and some of the parables, like the prodigal son and the Good Samaritan, are referred to as special Matthew and special Luke. Most scholars will date the writings of Matthew and Luke between 80 and 90 CE. The Gospel of John is generally accepted to have been written around 85 to 95 CE. Whether or not the writer of John knew of and used the Gospel of Mark in the Sayings Q document is still hotly debated. However, in 1938, the position that John is an independent tradition gained wide acceptance. It is the majority opinion held today by most scholars, including C.H. Dodd and Raymond Brown. Both Brown and Dodd contend that the ministry of Jesus as presented in John is too different to have depended on the synoptic Gospels. The Gospels are our major source of knowledge about Jesus, but some, given the history of the Gospel formation and noticing that there are differences in the Gospels, question whether or not the Gospels are reliable. Can we identify what came from the historical Jesus? John Mayer lists some criteria which are helpful in reaching a decision of whether or not a saying or action can be traced directly to Jesus, but cautions that such analysis is limited. He writes, "Granted the nature of ancient history in general, and the nature of the Gospels in particular, the criteria of historicity will usually produce judgments that are only more or less probable. Certainty is rarely to be had. As we have already seen in the Old Testament writings, the ancient historians did not treat history the way we do. The Gospels are no exception. It is important to remember that these works were written by believers, for the sake of the belief. Their primary concern was conveying the meaning of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, not in writing a biography." The function of the criteria is to pass from the merely possible to the really probable, to inspect various probabilities, and to decide which candidate is most probable. Meyer repeatedly stresses that none of the criteria can stand alone in determining that an action or utterance is historical. He lists 5 primary criteria. The criteria of embarrassment focuses on sayings or actions of Jesus that would have been embarrassing or difficult for the early church to explain away. Examples include the baptism of Jesus, who was sinless, by John the Baptist, or the claim that Jesus is the Son of God, but yet does not know the day or the hour. Meyer points out the limitations of this approach. Not many of these types of sayings or actions appear, certainly not enough to paint a portrait of Jesus. What we would consider embarrassing would not necessarily have been to the early church. The example here would be in Jesus' cry on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Form criticism will have us recognize this as Psalm 22. In seeing this as a lamentation, it shows a certain boldness and intimacy with God in crying out in this way. Another characteristic of a lamentation is that they end on a note of praise and glory to God. Jesus is glorified by God in his resurrection. The criterion of discontinuity focuses on the deeds or words of Jesus that cannot be derived from the time of Jesus or from the early church. Since we do not have a full definitive picture of what constituted the norm for Judaism or the early church would have been, it is difficult to ascertain what would have been considered discontinuous. Another limitation of this criteria is that it focuses on the extremes of Jesus' thought and action, and would paint a portrait of someone who, as Meyer suggests, would be so out of touch with his time and surroundings as to render his teachings completely unintelligible to his hearers. The best that this criterion can help to establish are the kinds of things that Jesus said or did. The criteria of multiple attestation focuses on the sayings or deeds that are presented in more than one source, that is, Mark, Q, Paul, John, and or in more than one literary form. For example, based on this criterion, the phrase "the kingdom of God" was likely a phrase used by Jesus. Similarly, the words "over the bread and wine" were likely words used by Jesus. Meyer points out that the absence of multiple attestations does not necessarily rule a phrase out. The use of the term Abba for God is generally attributed to Jesus on other grounds, even though it is only mentioned in one place in the New Testament. The criterion of coherence or conformity attributes sayings of Jesus as historical based on how well the phrase conforms to other sayings of Jesus that have been established by the other criteria to be probably historical. We must use this criterion with caution. Our Western worldview has a tendency to want perfect consistency, what Meyer terms Western philosophical principle of non-contradiction. Ancient Semitic thought, however, he points out, delighted in paradoxical statements that held opposites in tension. The criterion of rejection and execution directs attention to those words and deeds of Jesus which would have led to his trial and execution. Most notably would be his cleansing of the temple as an example here. The secondary, and in Meyer's estimation less reliable, criteria include the criterion of traces of Aramaic. The ability or ease of translating a saying from Greek to Aramaic, or the existence of Semitisms, does not necessarily reflect an original saying of Jesus. In the first case, the case of translating from Greek to Aramaic might be a reflection with the way that the translation from Aramaic to Greek occurred in the first place, whether it was word for word or whether it was a more sense-equivalent type of translation. In the case of a sense-equivalent type translation, the Greek would be, in fact, rather elegant Greek, and reverse engineering to Aramaic would provide a clumsy translation. In the second case, a presumption that Semitisms reflected an attempt to mimic the language of the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Old Testament, would be to miss the presence of Semitisms in ordinary Greek of Jesus' time. The criterion of Palestinian environment. This criterion asserts that any saying of Jesus which reflects the custom or practices of Palestine in the first century have a good chance of being authentic. The issue with this criterion is that it assumes that there would have been significant differences between Palestine in 33 CE from the Palestine of 29 CE. Meyer suggests that using the negative form of this criterion is more helpful. Anything that reflects social, political, economic, or religious conditions that existed only outside of Palestine or only after the death of Jesus could be considered inauthentic. The criterion of vividness of narration. Some scholars take the details within a narrative as evidence that the story is an eyewitness account. Meyer concedes that this may get us to the oral tradition behind the written text, but it does not necessarily get back to the historical Jesus. Conversely, a short narrative does not necessarily imply that something is not historical. The terseness of the story may simply fit a particular genre. In order to answer the question of the reliability of the Gospels, and understanding that the Gospels are not historical accounts of Jesus, we must ask ourselves what it is that the Gospels are trying to tell us. The word exegesis comes from a Greek word which means to lead out of, or the reading out of the meaning of a text. It is the critical analysis and interpretation of a text. It is an activity that we engage in every day, though we may not necessarily be aware of it. You can say that the goal of biblical exegesis is to reach an informed understanding of the text. The amount of effort necessary for the interpretation of any text varies greatly. Some texts, which are written in common day-to-day language, do not require much effort and are readily understood. Other texts, such as laws, are written in highly specialized language. Lawyers and judges spend much of their time exegeting or interpreting laws and law codes and studying the history of their application. Another important factor in the ease of interpreting a text is the extent to which the writer and the reader or receiver of the text share in common in the way of language, culture, and experience. In many respects, biblical studies endeavors to build a bridge between today's world and a world that existed 2,000 years ago. Whether we build a strong bridge or a rickety one depends on how we approach biblical exegesis. A method which is employed in the analysis of the text is referred to as a criticism. Criticism here should be understood as an analysis technique, not as an expression of disapproval or fault-finding. The techniques for biblical exegesis are ever evolving, and new approaches are developed. I will identify 4 of the traditional methods of biblical criticism, though many more exist. First is form criticism. We read different material with different expectations. When we read an ad, for example, we know that the author is trying to sell us something, and so we approach the facts claimed in the ad with a certain amount of caution. The social setting of a text, also called the Sitz und Leben, acknowledges that certain forms serve certain functions. Form criticism identifies these forms and how they diverge from the norm. In source criticism, we seek to identify the underlying sources of a text, whether they be oral or written. Redaction criticism then looks at the author's use of their sources and his purposes in shaping a text. Textual criticism focuses on the texts that are available to us. Currently, we know of about 5,000 fragments of the New Testament, and examines the differences between these texts. The Gospels were originally written in Greek, but we do not have any of the originals. The copies were handwritten from the first copy right up to the invention of the printing press. Many times these copies do not agree among themselves, but this is mostly in minor matters. There are several reasons for the variance that we find. The first 2 causes of variance can be attributed to scribal error and scribal editing or correcting. Mistakes could arise as a result of misreading a text when copying, mishearing the text if it was being read, or in the case of a text being read to a scribe, even the reader misreading the text. While some corrections were to omit something that might not seem correct to the scribe, the deliberate changes also included modernizing spellings or supplementing the text with explanatory phrases. Variance in a text could also be produced as the result of having copied from copies that were in different languages. There is an old saying that if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If it sounded to you like Dr. Ehrman was hammering on a single point, you'd be correct. Dr. Ehrman's conclusions are based principally on the use of a single tool of exegesis, textual criticism. It goes without saying that if you only have one tool in your toolbox, then you are going to be severely limited to what you can build with it. Similarly, if you only use one tool of exegesis, you will be severely limited in what meaning you might be able to draw out of the text. This is not to say that focus on a single technique would not bring some valuable insights, but as Raymond Brown writes, different approaches to the text must be combined so that no criticism becomes the exclusive manner of interpretation. Interpreters who employ the various forms of criticism in a complementary way will arrive at a much fuller meaning of the biblical text.